Spring raged on the street, and there was still heavy stale air in the waiting room. I already opened the windows to ventilate and put a wooden block under the doors to keep them open. But, despite the drafts, the smell stayed the same. Such an impression that he has crawled into these walls, on a wooden bench, into the cement floor. Yes, it's not smart, because homeless people often visit here, gypsy squads, fortune teller, nice, soothsayers, and many other original personalities. Normally there are hardly any passengers, everyone tries to arrive closer to the train departure and is not particularly late. Even in the big hall decree immediately go to the first. Even in rainy weather, I prefer to stand outside under a visor to breathe the smell. There were very few people in the dry hall today. Duty drew attention to the old woman, sitting in the corner by the window. I saw it yesterday on the day shift. Here and today she spotted her on the first round. Interestingly, the old lady went home again came or she spent the night right and Heredity decided to watch the old woman. That tired, sat in the extreme place in the corner and tilted her head slightly to one side. Lee looked out the window at the empty platform, dozing. Duty decided to check. She passed by the neighboring one and saw that the woman turned her head in her direction. She did not sleep. But what has she been doing here for so long? The old woman was really going to leave. She did not know the final destination, couldn't decide on a route, even with direction. For many it will be strange, because everyone who leaves the house with a suitcase and knapsack in hand understands at least which way will it go. Mrs. Clark didn't even think about it when hastily packed up her belongings and fled. And the apartments. She recently had the idea to just go somewhere to find an abandoned house in the village and start living there. Directly like in the cartoon about. Because there is a shortage of people in the villages, there are empty houses. Why wouldn't know here only at the station? She was already confused, started thinking, what could be wrong, and maybe return to where she will return is. Something will change. Hardly Lee's son, after all, grew up quite a stranger. Then right after school Mrs. Clark fell in love with a handsome young man. She herself was one of the first beauties of the class. Groom hurried with a marriage proposal. Mrs. Clark didn't take too long to reply, and they got married. His husband went uphill, his company prospered, and Mrs. Clark was his reliable rear, his cozy family nest. Husband said, and quote, Mrs. Clark, no need to study further, a lot, it's all a waste of time. Why would she work, if he provides a family with absolutely everything? And quote, Mrs. Clark is happy to know that she is pregnant. Husband also rejoiced at his future heir, and that now he will stop inventing some kind of study for himself, and will take care of the pregnancy, raising a child. So it was the first year with a baby in her arms. Mrs. Clark completely ceased to be interested in information on admission to further studies, because now all my free time was occupied by a newborn Mr. Clark. Mrs. Clark then so zealously took up cleaning the house, cooking unusual exotic dishes, and husband, tasting with pleasure, but the huge culinary potential did not disappear. But it didn't matter to her at all. For it was the most important two people, son and husband. For my husband, this list turned out to be somewhat longer. There was room for 2 more mistresses, place FSH them in a prominent place, the legitimacy of the wife of such a cool and rich businessman. My hubby decided, it's time to change something for your family. For sons were hired immediately by some who worked with him in turn and lived in the same mansion. A woman didn't understand, why did my husband do this, because now she was actually removed from raising her son. Then it turned out that she was also suspended from marital obligations, and for a long time. Now it's time to get rid of her. Husband filed for divorce, and we will issue it quickly, as well as custody of the son, because he lived in excellent conditions, unlike ex-wife. Kicked out into the street, where is the irony of whom to entrust the child? At first Mrs. Clark could visit my son, hang out with him on the weekends, but only in the presence of one and a removal and guardianship officer. Then they completely tried to erase little Mr. Clark from his life. He didn't understand anything, just cried at first. A husband then organized a legal ban on a date with his son so as not to injure the child by the constant appearance in his life. After all, the baby can't understand why other mothers have children, and only he has a mother who comes every day, then throws it again, leaves and quits. So Mrs. Clark was completely erased. And a bright future for a new family. Formerly married one of his past mistresses, and a couple of years later divorced again and married too. Both new mothers tried to please little Mr. Clark, raising him as a spoiled and capricious egoist. Only my mother could not see this, don't know. Mrs. Clark then, after your divorce, returned to her parents. In their modest apartment she had to go to work, but after school she never received an education in any specialty. The only thing I could do was cook it. Here I went to a restaurant, first as assistant chef, and then as a senior pastry chef. Personal life, and so there was no time to build. All in her spare time she cared for the elderly, sick parents, often thought of sons, crying at night, but I didn't even dare to approach him. Even didn't know that right after school he marries his classmate. Mrs. Clark not only no one thought to invite, and they didn't even tell her, as if it was not her child. But anything can ever end. Here in Inui can have problems with business and finances. A woman quickly ran away with everyone on personal savings and valuables, and then developed through the court and remembered your name. Former husband tried to pull the business, borrowed money, and then made the following, to pay for the previous. When husband couldn't resist, died of a stroke right in the office. It turned out that the son and his wife only have personal belongings, the rest was sold for debts by banks. Caught on Mr. Clark Street, remember, where it was, his own mother Mrs. Clark cried with happiness, and the son and daughter-in-law wrinkled their noses in disgust. They are accustomed to a completely different life. Mother trying to take care of my son, surrounded him with tenderness and care. He took it for granted, because from childhood I got used to servants, fulfilling all his whims. About mother Mr. Clark I've only heard bad things. He is often reminded how he cried because of her at those meetings, conducted under the supervision of social workers. Is it true, father told him, what Mr. Clark cried at the beginning, that he did not want to walk with his mother? The truth is, he cried after his mother left. On the contrary, I didn't want to let her go, no one ever told Mr. Clark all the truth. Yes, he wouldn't believe it. This wouldn't matter if it had not resulted in irritation and neglect of a loving mother. Furthermore, he began to shout at her, always unhappy, idle and living on her money, selectors and pensioners. His wife was an exact copy of her husband. Mrs. Clark didn't understand at what point her life turned into hell. After all it was before, how did my son get drunk? Just drunk. Wealth aggression. Hatred to her own mother began to go out with fists. Mrs. Clark began to hide bruises on his face with the help of foundation, but they couldn't always help. Soulful they certainly could not hide the wounds, do not paint over. She couldn't kick her son out of the house. She is not like that, and doesn't kick people out. Just more and more Mrs. Clark started to think that she will have to clean out of the apartment to hell. So it happened this morning, while everyone was sleeping after yesterday's drunken spree, Mrs. Clark secretly collected suitcases, clothes, money and documents and quietly slipped out of the apartment. In big basket, left over from mother, Mrs. Clark imposed food, enough for the first time. With all this good, she arrived at the station. Here just where to go, she did not know. Just sitting there, I thought I was waiting for the solution to come by itself. Which some abandoned huts, to have a roof over your head. She is happy with this option. Yes, for someone here there is too much dirt, homeless, a cozy place for her, and here the TV, and homeless people are not so scary compared to drunken orgies, where she has always been a punching bag for fists. Mr. Clark and Mrs. Clark straightened the handkerchief. She specially tied him, to at least cover the bruises from beatings. Near the station attendant opened the lower part of the large window for ventilation and the woman at the window, "Not you could turn that knob up there, thank you." Yes, yes, certainly. Mrs. Clark easily got up and reached for the handle. Duty at the station was surprised to notice that the old woman is not always an old woman, but still quite a young woman. Just awkward baggy clothes the senile feet to make her 20 years older. Still tired of lowered shoulders and a hunched back, as if closing over someone, like when hitting. Announcer announced, a passing train to the capital. Some people stirred, for collecting bags and packages, hurried to the platform. Here, and a big new train. In the windows of the plate, in large numbers, the numbers of the wagons. Announcer announces the completion of boarding and departure of the train from the platform. Mrs. Clark was watching the train, on which she did not decide to take a ticket. He goes without her into a brighter future. Won't someone else try to jump out of the outgoing car, but in vain, the train has already left. Man turns around and slowly walks along the platform. High, stately, fashionably dressed, in one word solid person. He caught up with the open window, looked there, and stopped looking at Mrs. Clark, then resolutely went inside, bypassing all the sunbeds of the homeless and the camp of nomadic fortune-tellers, resting in the next row. Man, I was still able to get through to her. Angela, it's you. I looked around in surprise from head to toe. A you she couldn't remember. Where did you see that face? Yes, it is me, Billy, Autumn Genius. Do you remember, I wrote poems about Autumn Nut, you gave me that nickname. But, remembering, the man did not lag behind her with questions. Mrs. Clark, I looked and imagined him as a small ordinary schoolboy, party neighbor. But exactly, it's him. Mrs. Clark broke into a smile. She had no contact with friends for a long time. After beating her son, she was embarrassed to go out, in conversations with neighbors to explain the bruises of their origin. Here is such a joyful Billy, old school friend. They sat and talked for a long time, but couldn't talk. Mrs. Clark did not understand. How did she manage to tell him all her troubles, his unhappy family life, short-term motherhood, and today's realities? Cried I so Mrs. Clark from her own home. You don't want to stay with me for a while, you? I have always made such delicious food, haven't forgotten yet, how my favorite Claire. If you need to cook. Cook. Angela was delighted. Not only cook, I still need a friend, who I could trust, who would like to sit and talk heart to heart. Knit, Persian, it's work. At all one. What job you know, who is educated less working mayor I working. Mayor of our city. You didn't know me elected 2 years ago, smiled old school friend. Exactly. So that's why your face is so familiar to me. You sorry, that I didn't recognize right away. Years ago, your son moved stones. I started mine, so I'm not aware of political events not only in the city, but also in the world. Billy already has the body and the suitcase to the exit from the waiting room. Mrs. Clark carried her basket, and the duty officer with the rest of the employees timidly peeked around the corner, in a half voice, discussing the visit of the mayor. Here, turns out, who is this grandmother waiting for? Mayor was afraid, and not because he is a stupid fool, and therefore, that after the last mayors, he seriously took up the city. He did not drive expensive foreign cars, escorted by security. He could go to a restaurant at any time, to school, where he was not expected, and didn't prepare. One day he came to school, it was built just 3 years ago. So everything must be new, including a modern dining room. Passed straight to the principal's office, who is just so dumbfounded that I couldn't get up the first time. Billy saw the confusion of the director. He heard rumors that not everything is so good in those walls, how they trumpet on every corner. It was lunchtime, and the mayor invited the director to go down to the dining room. Look, what do kids eat? Hungry very. Feed. Director. Often nodded his head, at the same time trying to wipe the sweat off my forehead. He reached for the phone. I'll call to bring it here. No. Let's go to the dining room. No need to call anywhere, I'll eat that. What's going on? Children. He climbed down. Director walked in front of him as if on 1 to 3. How only at the end of the corridor did the door of the dining room appear, so the smell of sour cabbage and something burnt reached the denunciation. Orsini entered the dining room, sat at an empty table. Nearby children were sitting beside him. One of the children caught a still live cockroach on a plate. It is seen that the child is now sick. He jumped up and ran away. Then Billy 100 walked between the rows, looked then, what do kids eat? Some boy even tried a casserole, that's how she got burned, that only tasted like Harry. Director and the dining room were removed on the same day. School on the weekend. News about such a visit quickly scattered around the city, and parents began to notice that children come home from school full. So it was the same with other institutions. Unsuffered the most, if you could say so, administration itself. At first, a lot of positions were simply cut. Remaining had to get out of the car a block from the place of work. After all, the mayor himself did not use official vehicles. They arrived at Billy's house. Mrs. Clark looked at the big house. Billy, a sentence, you don't think, it's not because that I am the mayor, this my father and I built when I started my business. Father, that's not it. House there is, we pass, do not be shy. I live alone. A woman long ago fled abroad with her lover. Mrs. Clark looked at him, he was so calm about it. Orsini noticed her look, yes, don't look at me like that, not we had love. How it turned out, both were wrong. Let's help you undress. Billy took outerwear Mrs. Clark and we are waiting, while she takes off her headscarf by the women of the case. After still taking off, and when the man realized why wasn't she in a hurry, Orsini turned her towards him. Mrs. Clark, yes, how is it? Then he remembered this beautiful girl, cheerful. Now she was about 50, but when he saw her at the station, did not immediately recognize, precisely because she looked like she was 70. Billy hugged Angela, just, like a friend, all will be good, everything will be all right. You don't need to go back. Mrs. Clark stayed at Billy's house, he was constantly at work, she did not leave the gate. Men understood, what Mrs. Clark? Only here you feel safe. Somehow in the evening a few days passed after, how Mrs. Clark settled. Orsini leaned back in his chair after a hearty dinner and said, Mrs. Clark, if you feed me like that, then I'll just stop crawling through the door. She laughed, what you say that you are always slim. After Billy said seriously, up, to me seems, you must write an application for your son and daughter-in-law. That, what they were doing, it didn't go through any gate. I cannot, Billy, he is my son. This is somehow wrong. Beat your own mother right, no, certainly, but that's how his father raised him. You know, that they didn't let me near him and always said, how bad I am. Of course your deeds are in vain. Such people do not change, they need to be punished. Moreover, they did not return to this conversation. Mrs. Clark had a lot of free time. It's spring outside. She put the whole house in perfect order and decided that it is necessary to plant flowers. House big and nice yard, but somehow empty, no living creatures. One of the evenings Farsi did not return home. He entered the yard and froze. Mrs. Clark planted some flowers, maybe other plants. Yeah, it didn't matter. Importantly, it was different. Mrs. Clark hummed. She was in a t-shirt. Orsini recognized his old t-shirt and skirt, which he was not wearing. Bruises long gone from that, what Mrs. Clark sleeps well and eats well. To look like she got better. So better, what Billy suddenly remembered that once was in love with her. He quietly approached Mrs. Clark and noticed him. Hello, something I dug. Now warm up for dinner. Mrs. Clark, let's go to a restaurant. To the restaurant. Mrs. Clark looked at him confused. You I do not like, how do I cook, write it then here you're ready for. Very like, and you know about it. Just you've been here for over a month, and I'm even a fool, didn't think about it. That you sit on four walls and do not go anywhere. Billy, I am so very grateful to you, and I haven't been to a restaurant since I was young, and I don't have any dresses. Oh, I'm a fool. Cold, Mrs. Clark, we'll be at home today. I have a lot to do tomorrow. Let's go to a restaurant on Friday, and it's not even discussed. I will use my privileges and the mayor and ask my assistant to call on you tomorrow. She was confused, she did not know how to react. Now she understood, what does Billy like, how is it that no one needs the old ones? I am your personal life, Mrs. Clark gave up a long time ago, when the ex-husband put her out the gate. Honestly speaking, she no longer understood how to behave with men, especially with such, like Billy. On the next day, a young nice girl came to her. Hello, my name is Joyce. Billy sent to help you. Young woman Angela looked with interest. It is seen that this woman was once very good, although now, through the tormented appearance, this beauty was visible. Young woman examined Mrs. Clark head to toe, and then she said, How would you like for me to go to the store with you or to bring some dresses here to try on what you? Certainly, I will go with you. Only the girl looked at her questioningly. What happened? Billy said, You don't really like going out. Then I can. Herself not very fond of hopefully panicky afraid, but to sit all my life, hiding from people, also impossible. But the department was not in it. Al, I have very little money, I'm afraid, not enough to pay. The girl smiled. Billy waited for my card and said, to buy only the best. Mrs. Clark was embarrassed. Joyce realized suddenly what their mayor saw in this woman. She was not only beautiful, she was real. 3 hours later, I did not return home, loaded with packages. But turned out to be a very good girl, you can say that they got along. At home Mrs. Clark said, no lunch and won't let go. Young woman admired how delicious everything was, and then seriously asked, Mrs. Clark, can I ask you? Yes, certainly, Allie, ask. Do you like Billy? Mrs. Clark was silent for a minute. You don't think I am not for him, me for myself, for you. Like Joyce, I really like it. Only who skiff then Heger would him like that, like me badly. Do you know our mayor? Means so, what time are you going to the restaurant tomorrow? I will book you a beauty salon and pick you up at 4 o'clock, and then I can get myself together. Woman smiled. Yes, they have a real conspiracy. On the next day, the girl took Angela. To her, it took a lot of effort to ask Billy. He tried everything, where the girl needed it. I had to lie, what about the dental, Ho thought. By 2 hours Mrs. Clark was not to know. Before she was a completely different woman, rejuvenated, beautiful, and such dazzling beauty that you couldn't take your eyes off. They let's go home, chose a dress from the things bought yesterday, shoes, and the girl saw with satisfaction that Mrs. Clark without any tension walks in high heels and generally behaves like a true lady. They chatted and lost track of time. When Joyce realized, had to run away, today Billy was in the car. She jumped out of the gate and rushed away. Orsini just turned into an alley. To him it seemed that he saw his secretary, but then he decided, what seemed, after all, she went to treat a tooth. Orsini took a small bouquet and went to the house. He entered and immediately dropped the flowers. Before he was Angela. He understood, what is this Mrs. Clark just because no one else could be here, and quote, silence dragged on. Mrs. Clark was quite the effect. Can a woman at 50 look great, Billy, and flowers to me? He leaned over quickly, picked up the bouquet, and handed it to her. Sorry, I'm just smitten. They had a wonderful evening at the restaurant, talked a lot, laughed, and at the end of the evening Billy asked, is she considering marrying me again? Proposal, are you doing me? She was embarrassed, and then he said that they will return to this conversation. They headed for the exit. Billy asked, does she want to go for a walk? It's such a wonderful evening. Certainly, of course I wanted, really wanted. They go down the path, who walked along the park. All of a sudden, the man mischievously did not look at, Do you want ice cream? We will go and eat cold ice cream. You know, I really want to. Mrs. Clark really felt how much she wanted ice cream. Costs here, me now, shop across the road. Fine. Mrs. Clark enjoyed it. For many years I haven't been so good. She even closed his eyes from his thoughts. Ma'am, are you Mrs. Clark? Shuddered. Before she stood, swinging, son, next to him is his daughter-in-law. They surprised, she was considered. So you are alive? I think that paper does not come to me for the inheritance of the apartment. I'm watching, appliances poured. Means there is some money Cher son needs. Threw son to the mercy of fate and wound up. Who does that? Mrs. Clark took a step back. Mr. Clark, I have no money, and if there were, then I wouldn't give them to you. It's a holiday work, you are healthy man. Brother, work. Mommy, what do I need for what gave birth, if you can't feed? Daughter-in-law pushed her, and Mrs. Clark had difficulty keeping her feet. Well, quickly moved away from her. Billy got up, not a drunken couple, about, defender, look, it's that mother, in old age you began to twist your tail. Young people, go your way higher. No, if she has no money, then you will definitely have VLAN, the suit is not cheap. Mr. Clark. Billy. But Tattoo did not think to retreat. Mr. Clark, see that he is not afraid, Swan. Mrs. Clark cried out. Orsini somehow quickly twisted his hand Mr. Clark and then howled. Nobody did not see the moment when a knife flashed in the hands of the daughter-in-law. Billy, bye. Mrs. Clark screamed. Drunk, the couple took off running. I'm crying. Mrs. Clark came running loot, and she held the man's head in her hands and repeated, Please, please, just do not go away, just don't leave me. I can't live without you. Billy tried to open my eyes. Head was like poured with iron, a terribly hurt side. He remembered everything, what happened. Where same Mrs. Clark, what with her finally eyes opened. He immediately saw her eyes, by which it was visible that they haven't slept in a long time, and cried a lot. Mrs. Clark, Billy, Billy. Now, I'll call the doctor. Wait, I didn't have time to ask. You will marry me, Mrs. Clark looked at him in surprise, and then sighed, but, certainly, I'll go out. How I am now without you, my protector. She smiled, and tears ran down my face. Not cry, everything is fine, already good. Billy fell asleep with a smile. Now everything will be fine for sure. Court took place immediately, as soon as Billy was discharged. Mrs. Clark was also in court. She told everything, and how they beat her, how the money was taken. Planted not only the bride, but also son. Woman held back and did not cry when they were taken out of the courtroom.